Hello, everyone. It's very nice meeting you again. Actually, when I reflect what I have learned yesterday's sessions, I think I will differentiate two parts. One is my learnings um, from Enrique's lectures, and another one is my learnings from group discussions. So first on the Enrique's lectures. So um, the first thing I got from Enrique's lecture is um, regarding with definitions of think tanks. I don't remember what it is exactly about the definitions, but what I got is it is the organizations who studies policies and feeding the policies, and then one thing interesting is independent. So I'm interesting what is it, independence. And then this this thinking is linking up um uh with the realities on the grounds, because we also consider some of the organizations which is affiliated, or which is even named as a government think tanks or government backed think tanks. So uh, what I think is there's an inconsistency between the definitions and then the realities. So we really need to understand on that. And then think tanks, the functions of think tanks are quite diverse. And then the role of the think tanks, the fee of the think tanks working on is uh, quite boundaryless. It is not limited to a certain fee of, like, for example, political, economics, medias. It is its function is quite lines in the sand. It is quite interconnected and mingles and things like that. So that's very interesting, and it is also quite reflected um, with realities, what I think, based on the situations in Myanmar. And I think some of the other countries that I'm somewhat familiar. So and another thing is think tanks is the field of areas uh, dominant mainly by male. So it's very patriarchal arena in the society. So this is what I learned from the Enrique's lecture yesterday. And another part is what I learned from the uh, our group discussion. So uh, first of all, I now understand that several countries in the world, like when I met Tonya at yesterday from Tunis, and a lady from Serbia. We have our societies have a struggle to defend democracy and human rights, uh, even though we generally are considered as having democratic political transitions. So I think the role of think tanks and research organizations in that situations conditions is uh, very much interesting and challenging as well. How to tackle this kind of uh, remaining authoritarian natures of the state. Uh, I mean, how the role of think tanks can be in order to be inclusive, evidence-based policy making in support of inclusive democracy. So things like that. And then another thing I have learned from another group discussions is that is think tanks in Brazil and Myanmar as well, and India's are struggling for fundings, and especially another thing is struggling to be recognized as effective, policy advocates in state policy making. So, um, how we can better promote evidence-based policy making, in which the role of think tanks is uh, very much seen and very much foreseen for a country like Myanmar. So this is what I have learned about yesterday's sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Seth. That was really interesting. And I'll just do a brief recap because it segues into today's presentations today. So we had the definitions for think tank. There was some questioning about independence and the functions being quite diverse. Think tanks operating in a field that is in different fields, occupying a porous space between different organizations. All the questions that are still left that are still leaving you wondering, we can still address today. We have today Peter Taylor with us. We're very glad that he's able to join the School for Think Tankers. Peter is currently the Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, in Brighton in the UK. He was previously the Director of Strategic Development at IDRC, and he was responsible for leading IDRC strategic planning processes. And maybe you already know him because he was the associate director for the Think Tank Initiative, an initiative I think many of you know already, or probably wanted to be funded by them. And Peter also has more than 30 years of experience in international development. He has a PhD and MSc and now works at IDS. He has research, teaching, and writing interests, and in theory and practice of organizational development and capacity strengthening, evaluation and learning, and facilitation of participatory and social change processes in diverse contexts. He has experience all over the world, and we're very happy to have him here. So I'll give unless anyone has any questions directly, I'll give the word to Peter so we don't go too much over time. So thank you, Peter, for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrea, for that kind introduction. Basically, I really find the whole issue of think tanks very interesting. I've worked in it in this sort of field now for a number of years, almost accidentally. It certainly wasn't that one day I woke up and thought, "Oh, I must go and study about think tanks." Somehow, it just one of these things that happened over time. And part of the reason for that was because of, as Andrea just said, my going to IDRC in 2009 and being involved in this program called the Think Tank Initiative. And essentially, the Think Tank Initiative was a program over 10 years to support think tanks in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, helping them to move on a path to sustainability. And before I joined IDRC, I'd been working in what we might now call a think tank in the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. Actually, we don't usually use the term think tank to describe ourselves. Interestingly, we often describe ourselves as an institution that does engaged research and teaching in order to contribute towards sustainable transformations. So that's our sort of way of describing ourselves. And this idea of independence is actually very important for us as well, because as we'll talk more about today, this whole issue about engaging in public policy processes by bringing evidence, co-creating knowledge, engaging different stakeholders, convening spaces, but also supporting the emergence of policies that make a positive difference in people's lives is really central to what we do. And in doing so, we also understand that issues of politics and power are very important too. And so that's really what I'm going to talk a little bit about this morning. If you're interested, and I'm sure you probably are, because I know there's lots of discussion yesterday about definitions. I've just put in the chat, in the think tank initiative, what we described, the term, the explanation that we use to describe think tanks. So I'll leave it there. We thought a lot about this because there was so much debate, and many of the institutions that we were working with and supporting over 10 years, which began around 50 in total. Again, not many of them called themselves think tanks initially. Sometimes they were really seen as civil society organizations or as policy research organizations. I always very much liked, I think the first time I heard the expression a think and do tank, which was Grupo Faro in Ecuador, and I know that you're going to be interacting with Orazio Bellatini later on, which is great. So that is, I think, just something to say that the way we describe ourselves is very much related to what we do, but also the vision that we have for the difference that we want to make in the world. And you can spend a lot of time really sort of working through the label in question. And I think it's interesting when it causes you to reflect on what you are trying to achieve through your work and how you want to do that. But today, this topic is really primarily thinking about the difference that think tanks can make in the world and how think tanks can position themselves in order to be able to do that most effectively. What kinds of functions help them to do that, and also in relation to what kinds of issues that they're trying to tackle, and also some issues around power relations, which affects the ability of think tanks in different contexts to be able to achieve what they want to set out to do. So Kike said yesterday the purpose of his presentation was to promote more questions than everyone going away with answers. So I think this session is in the same kind of spirit, but I do hope we'll have a good discussion along the way as well, and we'll break along the way as well for a chance for some interaction. We're not going to use groups in this particular session because we just felt it would be good to keep everybody in one shared space, but I am keen to create some chances for you to certainly put questions and comments in the chat, but also we're going to have a small number of polls for you to share your views, and also I hope to be able to have opportunity for you to actually share some insights and experiences as well. Okay, and now the hardest part of the whole thing is for me to try and share my screen. Let's see. I just managed to do it in the preparation for this, and I'll see if I can do it again. It always takes a moment just to come through. Let's see. Show the taskbar and share the screen. All right. So, Christina, can you give me a gesture? Yes, good. Thank you. Excellent. All right. So now let me get to the next slide. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. Key global challenges. How and what can think tanks do to make a difference? And this is me. And just to say, you're very welcome to get in touch afterwards. I work at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. That's our website. And that's my email address. And I'll be very happy if anyone has any questions that I'd like to continue the conversation afterwards. So today, we've got three main chunks of this presentation and conversation. First of all, what are the global challenges that need knowledge, data, and evidence? Secondly, what functions can think tanks play in response to these needs? And thirdly, how can think tanks help level the global research knowledge playing field? So the first two probably sound a bit more obvious, and I'm looking forward to getting your views. The third one might sound a little bit more abstract, but hopefully it will become clear when we get into it. All right, so now for the next slide. Okay, so I guess the first thing to say, and I think this goes without saying, that we're living in unprecedented times. We're seeing massive global disruptions and shocks in relation to the environment, economies, health, politics, societies, and technology. But at the heart of all of this, particularly during 2020 and continuing on into 2021, we have COVID-19. And as one person in a recent discussion I took part in said, so I don't claim this expression, COVID-19 is shining a spotlight, and it's bringing into sharp relief a range of fissures, cracks, and marginalizations in societies throughout the world. So we know that COVID-19 is a health crisis, but in fact, it's also multidimensional. And what it's really doing is highlighting how vulnerable the world, the entire world, is to epidemics, to infectious diseases. And it's also highlighting how limited our capacities for actually responding effectively and being prepared. And that challenge still goes on. We know that the disease and the subsequent health measures are all having dramatic impacts on livelihoods, economies, and societies, and they're having negative effects, especially on those who are already poor and marginalized. But we're also seeing on the positive side that the crisis is catalyzing local and global solidarities and different approaches to science and evidence. And that's going to be really important, not only for responding to COVID-19, but also to other global challenges. We know as well that changes to the climate and the environment are placing huge pressures on the planet, on our life support systems, and they're creating uncertainties in people's homes and livelihoods. And that goes for everyone, no matter in which country, in which city, in which village you live, or where you are based. Everyone is experiencing these kinds of challenges. And so we're really looking for responses to uncertainties, which is very difficult for humans, generally speaking, to manage, because we like to plan, and uncertainty is difficult for most of us. So we're looking at concerted action at the global, national, and local scales to transform the basic systems where these challenges are playing out. And this is in the context still where we're seeing the fallout of earlier economic shocks, as well as the COVID-19 crisis. We know that there is still an unequal distribution of wealth and resources within and across borders, and that is actually getting worse. We also know that in many contexts that the established orders of representative democracy are in serious crisis. And we know in many countries that the space for civil society is closing down or changing, and not necessarily in positive ways. And so at the same time as the space for active civil society to engage may be closing, though, we're also seeing a lot of informal democratic innovations, popular actions, protests, and movements, which are actually bringing citizens, communities, groups together to address challenges like climate change, like inequality. We know that there's still discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization taking place. We know that inequalities undermine livelihoods, health, freedom of religion and belief, status, and dignity. We know that migration and displacement are affecting social cohesion. But we also know that many groups are coming together and doing their best to reclaim rights and justice, and also helping to imagine new and inclusive futures. And at the back of all of this, we have massive rapid developments in digital technologies. The very fact that we're all on this call today is made possible because we have this thing called Zoom. Now, last year, perhaps a few people knew what Zoom was. Now I think everybody in the world knows Zoom in the same way that they know Google. Some of us are probably going a bit crazy from being zoomed out all the time. But at the same time, it allows us to participate in a space together. All of us are in different countries, and we're coming together for this period of time to have an opportunity to learn together, share experiences using the power of this technology, which is great. But we also know that digital and technological advances, although they're opening up possibilities to find new solutions, sometimes they can be used to close things down. We also know that digital technologies can be used as tools of oppression in certain regimes. So these are challenges that are affecting all of us. And at IDS, we talk a lot about now, we're increasingly moving away from ideas about talking about development. And we talk much, much more about inclusion, about equality, about diversity. And we talk about all of these challenges as universal because everyone is affected by them. It's not us and them or looking at others who are experiencing these kinds of challenges. They are really about the relationships between our planet and its sustainability, all the people who inhabit it, and their well-being and their prosperity. So effectively, every single one of us on this call and the billions of other people around the world. Now, in terms of big global challenges, I'm going to get your reflections on this in a moment. But one of the interesting outcomes of COVID-19, I think, has been the realization that research and evidence matter to all of us. So if you take vaccines, everybody is very interested in the science about vaccines. Who would have thought so many people in the world would be looking for evidence? What works? Why? How do we know it works? Will these vaccines do what they're supposed to? Can we believe the scientists? Is the evidence there? Is the data there? Every day, or almost every day in the UK, we have either the Prime Minister or a senior minister stands up, and beside that minister or the Prime Minister are scientists talking about evidence. They show graphs, they put data on a screen, and millions of people watch this. This is quite new for the UK, I can tell you, because it's not until recently that people were so obsessed with numbers. You know, the R number. What does that mean? Are the numbers going up? Are they going down? People every night on the news are watching this. So they're getting very, very interested in evidence. And this is a moment when research, evidence, data, and knowledge are in the spotlight. And it's an opportunity. We have big global frameworks like the SDGs, the Paris Agreement on Climate, which is great. The US has just rejoined it. Maybe there is hope in the world after all. We have frameworks for disaster risk reduction, on finance for development. And all of these are providing needs for data, for evidence, and for analysis. We also know that right now, when we look across these different dimensions, whether it's to do with climate change, or it's to do with inequalities, or it's to do with health, or it's to do with the impact of new technologies and artificial intelligence, or it's about gender inequalities, that the progress that we've been seeing prior to the pandemic really taking hold has either stalled or been set in reverse. There's a great deal of attention being set, for example, looking at the indicators of progress towards the SDGs. I think it was on, yesterday, first thing yesterday morning, I was listening to Susanna Moorhead of the DAC saying that unfortunately, well, not just unfortunately, tragically, progress to many of the Sustainable Development Goals is now in reverse in many countries in the world. So how do we know then where progress is actually making a difference? We need research, we need evidence, we need data to see where changes are happening, where people are making a difference on the ground, where climate change perhaps is being whittled away, where inequalities are actually being reduced, where there are changes in the health indicators, and particularly now all of those factors which are affected by COVID-19, where we know that artificial intelligence and technologies are disrupting for good as well as for less positive reasons, and where there are significant changes in gender inequalities and where we're seeing improvements in women's empowerment and gender justice. So all of this is important, and we also not only to see the global data, but we need to see what's happening in ways which are differentiated. We need to be able to separate out these elements and to understand what is happening in any particular context, sometimes between populations, because we need to understand what will make a difference. And when interventions or actions are taken, or when policies are introduced and implemented, what is actually happening and who is being held accountable for the way that those things play out. So we have this big body of evidence and knowledge which is constantly being generated and contributed to. So how can we learn very intentionally and in an evidence-based way from the knowledge that's being generated around all these different responses to these global development challenges? How do we gather information on where things stand, where things are moving, where they're progressing, where there are still gaps, and where there are opportunities to do more? How do we move from being ambitious about a better world and aspiring for actions that will help us achieve that, and what can think tanks do to contribute to all of this? So what I'd like to do is ask Christina and Andrea to put our first poll up, if they would. And I have a question here asking you, in your workplace, whether you're in a think tank or you're in another form of organization, which global challenges are most relevant to your work? So just please check all those that you think are most relevant. It might be one, or it could be more than one, or it could be other. I'll give you a moment to do that. And then Andrea and Christina, maybe you can let me know when we've got a...
Peter, they can only choose one, so the answer is based on the key one.
Okay.
I'm sure there are many that they find important, but they can only choose one.
Okay, that's perfect. All right, that makes it even harder.
Yeah.
Pick the one, and then let's see what comes up.
I think it's done.
It's done? Okay.
Yeah.
Can we see the result? Oh, I'll need to... there we go. Okay, perfect. I can see it. Oh, look at that. Interesting. Politics gets the highest. That's interesting. And then, just looking in terms of sequence, then inequalities. Then in, let's see, economies, followed by environment. Health and societies come equal, and no other, interestingly. Okay, can I ask someone who wrote politics, why did you write that? Would somebody like to, maybe I could ask Andrea and Christina just to help me identify somebody. I don't know if they'd like to put a hand up because I've got my screen sharing at the moment, so it's less easy to see everybody. Who put politics and why did you say that that was most important?
Does anyone want to venture, or should we do finger choosing?
Teresa, I can see. Teresa, your hand is up.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Peter, for this presentation. I choose politics. Why? I currently work for a pro-European think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations. So and I'm in Italy. So when you work in a political environment, not Europe-friendly, skeptical, anti-EU, etc. Like, for example, Italy was until August 2019. Your job is really much harder because you need to find a different way to talk to those interlocutors who are not really open to your advocacy priorities, to your ideas and thinking.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. And I that resonates with me coming from the UK. We've just been through Brexit, which I hardly want to even talk about. But at IDS, we have a European engagement group because we believe that we are an institute that's based in the UK, but we are very much part of Europe. We don't see ourselves having to exit Europe simply because of Brexit. We want to continue being engaged. So I appreciate what you just said. Very important for us as well. Thanks for that. Okay. Who said economies? Do we have a hand? No one is admitting it.
I raise my hand.
Yes, please, come on in.
I believe that many social and environmental issues and even political issues that we have stem from root causes which are economic. And sometimes it's not on our radar, but we try to solve these social and environmental issues in an isolated way. But if the root cause is economic, you're in trouble, you know, you won't solve the issue.
Thanks, Xavier. Where are you based? First, for my knowledge.
Campinas, Brazil.
Brilliant. Thanks. Okay. Thank you for that. Merualesi. Apologies if I'm not saying your name correctly.
That's fine. Hi all. Mary will work, Peter. The organization I work for looks at contributing to economic growth through providing relevant skills for the labor market. So in the Pacific, there's this phenomenon called the Pacific paradox, where economies are really slow and sluggish to grow despite high levels of investment, whether they be from aid or from governments. One of the proposed ways of addressing this is to provide relevant skills that labour markets in the Pacific need. So that's the area that I work in specifically. And the overarching goal is to contribute to economic progress in a region where it's a wicked, wicked problem.
Brilliant. Thank you. Alia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alia, and I'm based in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. I'm a policymaker, but now transitioning to have my own think tank on longevity economy. But my previous work was also making sure that the UAE has a diverse economy. We've seen that our economy got hit by tourism because we depended, especially in Dubai as a city, on tourism a lot. So we need to diversify our economy more. So we need to rethink and redesign the policies and come up with innovative solutions and innovative ways away from oil. Abu Dhabi, the capital, has oil. Dubai doesn't have oil. So how do we diversify and come up with different solutions, different economies that will enhance our economic development in the future and create more jobs in the economy?
Great, thanks. Well, I think all who've spoken so far are giving very compelling reasons about why your work is important, and I think that's absolutely crucial. Identifying what the challenge is that you're trying to tackle, and then thinking, well, as a think tank or as a policy researcher, what is it that we can bring to that in order, hopefully, to make a positive difference? Let me just ask from all of you, who would like to have checked more than one of the little circles, who would like to have chosen more than one of them? Okay, Eduardo, you've appeared very quickly with your hand up. Which ones would you like to have ticked, and why would you like to have done more than one?
Well, my first reaction was to pick health and also environment. Obviously, the question was most relevant to my work. I work in environmental think tank, but the health crisis is obviously extinct many of the initiatives or projects that we have. So I think it has to be there as well. But as I could only pick one and it has to be related to my work, well, I went for environment and climate. But if I could pick both of them at least.
Thanks, Eduardo. Makeruche?
Yeah. So I selected economies, right? Because the think tank that I work for, the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, what we do is primarily economic research. However, I would have also selected inequalities because we also work on areas, bordering inequalities, not only economic inequality, but also education inequality. Nigeria has the highest number of out of school children. A lot of research projects that we work on, it borders on that as well.
Brilliant, thanks. So I'll ask others to contribute as we go through, but I think what both our last two speakers, Eduardo and Makeruche, have both pointed out is that many of these issues are related. They're not separate in total isolation. They're deeply connected, whether it's economies and inequalities, but then that also connects with education, as we just heard, or whether it's climate, environment, and health. So those things are inextricably related. And I think we could draw connections between almost all of those things that were there on the list, even though perhaps sometimes we may have to say, well, okay, our prime focus is on one particular issue. So what can think tanks do in order to help make a difference to these various challenges? And here are just a few ideas that I've seen think tanks actually contribute and I think can make a difference. First of all, obviously, doing research and evidence generation that can really understand what works and what doesn't, which can help to catalyze progress towards those global goals, towards frameworks and agreements. And it's a way of connecting these different global frameworks as well, again, so that they're not in isolation, so that when we're having conversations about climate or about international finance, they're not separated out. They're deeply connected. Second, obviously, data is hugely important. locating data, helping to understand better who accesses it and who uses it, making sense of it, and then getting that into the hands of different constituencies and communities who can use that data then to understand what's happening and what is not happening, and then to to use that information in order to ensure that those who are responsible for decisions being made and actions being taken are actually being held accountable. We can also see, importantly, the connections, as we've just heard in that conversation just now. It's not just the individual challenges, but it's often at the intersections between them where research opportunities and gaps are most critical. So, for example, with COVID-19, we know that there are multiple intersections between the pandemic, health, and the economy, society, environment, and politics. Those who are already being left behind are suffering the most from the pandemic because of inequalities, and then those inequalities will in turn mean that the economic impact of the pandemic will be most severe for those who are already left behind. It's a vicious cycle. So think tanks are very well placed because they're actually able to work through engagement with a range of different stakeholders who bring different views and perspectives on these different challenges, whether they're researchers, civil society, policy actors, private sector, to identify where the intersections are and then to find where evidence and data already exists, it's not being used, or where there are evidence and knowledge gaps. And also, while doing this, trying to understand more about the power and the politics which underlie the way in which all of these challenges play out in order to help people understand as well how to navigate those. And then also, because most research issues are global, but they also have local contexts, think tanks can also work and collaborate with those on the ground, co-creating knowledge together and identifying pathways forward which can actually make a difference, and then helping to bring that back up to global debates and dialogues. So think tanks are really important, what we'll call interlocutors, because they're connectors. They're involved in the business of knowledge, but the way they go about generating and creating knowledge with collaborators, with partners, with communities, with different kinds of group, citizens, different constituencies, with policy actors, allows for pathways to be generated which actually have an opportunity to contribute towards sustainability. But I'm just going to now move from what probably sounded like a really optimistic, aspirational, positive side to something which is, in a way, a little bit depressing. The fact is that although think tanks play a really important role in promoting learning, as a human species, we're actually pretty bad at learning. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples of why that's been a bit of a disaster, but also food for thought as to how we could perhaps try and change that. And pathways to change, which I've just mentioned, are not usually very straightforward. Those of you, probably not many of you, but me, unfortunately, who grew up in the 1960s, would remember a folk song called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? I won't try and sing it now because that would be very depressing. But there was a very famous line in there where it said, when will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? And that's a really good question because there's a huge amount of data which is already being produced through these processes of change, but we're just not very good at using it, whether it's in its raw form or because that data is not being synthesized, sense isn't being made of it, and the evidence isn't brought together, which actually helps ensure that lessons are learned and shared. So we're missing opportunities to learn lessons that have much wider reach and potential for adaptation and application beyond their immediate context. And the lessons that can be learned, when done well, can actually help drive new approaches, and it can help others join up and connect different change agendas and develop local solutions, which is very difficult to happen unless you have a very intentional process of learning. So we're constantly reminded in public that COVID-19 is a challenge that affects us all. But one of the reasons that it's been so problematic is because we were so badly prepared. And it's not for lack of warning. Warnings were there and predictions were there of a crisis for some time. Immediately following the SARS epidemic, now 2 decades ago, there were predictions already made for a further outbreak that would be something similar to SARS. Also, from Ebola, We know that experience has provided vital lessons which are really important, which show how public health responses can respond. And I must say, there's so much experience in Africa, in African countries, about responses to the Ebola epidemic that have just been ignored by many other nations and globally when thinking about how to respond to COVID-19. Belatedly, some of those lessons are being drawn upon and used, but much more could be done much more quickly about that. And unfortunately, many of the predictions that were made about another pandemic they've come to pass. And many of those earlier lessons, whether they're about strategies, practices, policies, political action, decision making, were ignored, and unfortunately, in many cases, are still being ignored. So that's rather a depressing story. We also saw, though, in 2020, interestingly, that it was a year when global attention moved to other matters, including very significant areas of injustice. And the Black Lives Matter movement is an interesting story because it demonstrates how a global movement could galvanize people to take action and challenge many people on privilege. And one of the things that it's demonstrated is that change is uncomfortable. Many people feel discomfort when thinking about the implications for examining their own privilege. I'd be in that same situation. These are uncomfortable processes to go through and to learn what are we learning from this kind of process, which is uncomfortable and disruptive enough that enables us to actually deal better, not only with matters of our own privilege and our own knowledge and our own positions in society, but also how we can act better in other situations for other kinds of social transformations. So the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is raising awareness of the necessity of decentralizing power, listening to and taking seriously the expertise and the needs of those most affected by a problem, instead of bringing top-down solutions by experts. So there's a lot to learn from movements like Black Lives Matter, which we can also bring to other global challenges, whether it's climate, whether it's health, whether it's the environment, whether it's inequalities of different kinds. And then thirdly, again, just on the matter of learning, here's a quote from Greta Thunberg. At the core of it, she asks, what's the point of learning facts when the most important facts clearly mean nothing to our society? And this is a tough call for think tanks, because think tanks are in the business of generating data, generating evidence, generating analysis. We just heard, Eduardo, you spoke about working on climate and the environment. I guess you do that because you believe that the work you do can potentially make a difference. Otherwise, why would you be doing it? Why would the others that you work with be trying to do that? You have an aspiration for a different and a better world. At the same time, we're hearing that evidence, that data has been very difficult to get taken up and taken seriously. And obviously, at the heart of this are issues of power and politics. So one thing to say about all of this is that I think we have to step back from the idea is that learning just happens. It's just inevitable in the ways that we expect it to happen. So as think tankers, we believe in the power of evidence and data. How do we actually then think about the way that things change? It's not just necessarily about giving access to robust and credible data. It's also because there are people with vested interests who will obstruct learning, who will obstruct change, and will obstruct the use of data and evidence, and will even introduce false evidence, facts which are irrelevant or essentially made up, and in order to obstruct processes of change which are based on genuine evidence and data. So learning and through it implementing ideas as a result, we know is a highly political act. It's bound up with incentives, egos, hierarchies, job descriptions, and influence over territory. And every change has costs as well as benefits. So we can't help but deal with the messy territories of power and politics. And power dynamics sit at the heart of how evidence is produced, used, and abused in response to policy dilemmas. So, for example, how we understand a problem, like the socioeconomic impact of lockdowns, something that many of us are experiencing right now, including here in the UK, that's shaped by our understanding of the world and our concerns for different kinds of outcomes, whether it's about societal, economic, or environmental change. And that then affects how evidence is produced and engaged with. So all these socio-cultural and political factors help determine whose evidence is seen as most relevant, authoritative, and legitimate. And it also highlights, as Kike was saying yesterday, and I think others of you were also pointing out, that even though we like to talk about impact pathways, log frames, and very orderly, rational, technical solutions, that doesn't reflect reality. Most change processes are very messy, they're not linear, they're very context related, and they're complex. So all of this has implications for methodology, how we think about knowledge, and how we engage with power and politics. And so my other point on this, and going back to one of my IDS colleagues, I'm delighted there's still part of our institute, Robert Chambers, who many years ago asked, whose knowledge counts? And so this, for think tanks, I think this is a really important question. It's another of those questions I throw out that doesn't necessarily have a direct answer to it. But as human beings, we're very good at finding our tribe. We like to come together in groups that serve our interests individually and collectively. So, for example, people who get involved in research and policy networks are often quite like-minded. They have similar interests, they have similar things which drive them to engage in that. And the danger of that is that it can exclude some voices from critical debates, and it can help shape dominant policy narratives because some groups get more leverage than others. So we've seen from science and health emergencies, for example, that both researchers and their policy partners need to really address the tendency to look at certain types of knowledge to be more valuable. And with something like COVID-19, initially, much of the discussion was about medical science. You know, what's the medical answer? It's the vaccine. It's a whole set of medical interventions that would help to prevent and reduce the spread of the disease. In fact, as we've seen increasingly, and obviously to, I think, probably everyone on this call, social sciences, whether it's around the economy or sociology or anthropology, political science, all these different disciplinary and methodological approaches actually are needed to really shed light on how change can actually happen in the light of the pandemic. For example, if you look at just one example that I've seen recently at IDS, we've been looking at responses to sanitation and hand washing in high density urban areas where people are very, very closely living very, very closely together, very confined spaces, very limited access to fresh water, and many, many challenging urban environmental difficulties that they live with on a daily basis, particularly relating to water and sanitation, and then implications for health. And then when a pandemic comes along, how do you socially distance? How do you practice hand washing? How do you actually manage to navigate all these new needs that arise when your conditions are already extremely difficult? And the interesting thing, of course, is that most of the solutions to this are being generated by people on the ground. It's not experts going into a high density urban area in Nairobi and saying, okay, this is what you need to do in order to, manage to practice social distancing and hand washing. People in those communities are working things out for themselves. They're generating that knowledge. How does that knowledge then get shared with others? That's a role where think tanks, for example, can help to play. And just to go back to a point on that previous one as well, again, a phrase that I think that, sorry, let's go back there. What's really crucial then is that we're not only thinking about different forms of knowledge as being important from different sources, but that also that knowledge is forming a process of empowerment that by being generators of that knowledge and seeing it used is actually empowering people to see what works and to be able to take actions. And then for think tanks in particular, a key implication is that understanding and engaging in processes which are political is just inevitable, but it's really important to do so in ways which are not partisan. So not alignment with particular political views, but ensuring an understanding and an engagement with knowledge as a political process. All right. So then what do think tanks need to do, and how can think tanks actually sort of deliver on this kind of agenda, which is very challenging? A number of ways I would put forward. Firstly, thinking about what can make a difference to improving people's lives, towards achieving a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world, we know that this is complex stuff, and there's a great deal of uncertainty. And unfortunately, we're up in a situation where for think tanks, very often you're dealing with funders and supporters who are looking for very short-term solutions. So one of the challenges for think tanks to do is actually to be able to engage with evidence which demonstrates why sometimes longer-term processes of research and engagement and knowledge generation are important if you want to really make longer-term changes. It's also important to acknowledge that the outcomes from research on complex issues take time. And as we just said, they're often messy and they're not linear. So many funders, I think, do increasingly understand that. But there's also a really strong attraction for many funders to see a return on their investment fast. And that's a challenge for think tanks when engaging with funders about demonstrating the messiness and the complexity of change processes in ways that funders can also get their head around and get on board with. Because very often funders and policymakers will say, don't tell me it's complex. Yeah, don't just tell me context matters. That's one thing to say it, but presenting that in a way which makes sense and is evidence-based is one of the challenges that I think tanks need to be able to do. Quality is also hugely important. Quality, I think, in the think tank initiative, we used to hear many times people would say, quality is the currency of our organization. It's very difficult to build. It's very easy to lose it. You can spend a long time undertaking research over a long period of time, doing it really well, ensuring that all the stages of the process are of high quality. And by that, I don't just mean the outputs. How do you initially identify the questions or the problems? Who do you identify are the key actors and stakeholders who need to be involved? How do you engage with them? How do you identify the methodology? How together do you act in that context to ensure that the research is actually generating useful knowledge? How do you identify ways of communicating and engaging around the process and the findings? All of those things have quality associated with them. And think tanks can do all of those things well. And in fact, they need to do all of those things well if they're going to be seen as credible and that their work will be seen as having a currency. Also, the connection to connecting research to societal needs and challenges. Obviously, research can cover many, many different things, but there are urgent needs. There are timely needs. There are needs for data, for evidence, which can get into the hands of people at the right time that can actually lead to actions which are relevant for societal needs right now. Making that research available, making the findings and the data accessible, getting that into the hands of those who need it. And then also acknowledging the importance of power and politics. These are all functions that think tanks can actually actively play and need to proactively play, I would say, in order to be able to prepared to navigate these very uncertain times, and also to provide convincing and compelling arguments to funders, particularly, and other supporters who can get behind the work and help to think tanks to do the work that they need to do. So how do you do it? Okay, time for another poll. Through which functions can think tanks make a difference to these global challenges? So if I could just ask, there we go. Now, this is multiple choice. This time, I'm not going to put you on the spot to choose one. You can pick as many as you like. Which of those functions do you think? But please, choose the ones that you feel are the most important. Can we rank them, Andrea, using this?
No.
No, okay.
We couldn't rank them. Just
don't worry. That's all right. So just pick the ones that you feel are the most important for their potential to make a difference. And then when all are done, Andre and Christina, we can put it up on the...
Okay, it's almost done.
Okay.
Okay, I think it's done now.
All right, so let's have a look. What have we got? Aha. So quite a split across. Perhaps not surprisingly, research comes out on top with 73%. But interestingly, policymaker engagement is very close behind at 70%. Civil society and citizen engagement also have quite a strong showing, 58% there. Advocacy, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. That's an interesting one. And communications are quite close. And then we also have capacity development also gets a few there too. Okay, I'm going to ask who put advocacy, and would you like to say why you picked that? Maybe we can have someone who didn't contribute in the previous round to share their view first of all. Okay, Okpanachi, let me ask you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So last year or 2 years ago, the organization I work for engaged services of an advocacy firm because we are trying to get the government to to increase taxes on tobacco products. So I think for given the country that I am in, research alone and maybe just engagement might not really do the trick if you don't involve advocacy.
Okay. Where are you, Okpanachi?
I work at Center for the Study of the Economics of Africa, Abuja, Nigeria.
Okay, great. So tax, that's a very tricky one to get people to change the policies and actually make significant changes. So yeah, trying to bring influence to bear on the policy environment around that. Absolutely, I totally get that. Let's have another view. Who also put advocacy? Marco.
Yeah, hello. I'm Marco. I'm from Belgrade Center for Security Policy from Serbia. Just a quick answer. So I checked the research and advocacy actually because, but you asked about advocacy, and to my opinion, all other things such as communication, policymaker engagement, and civil society, citizen engagement can be perceived as part of advocacy. So that is why I checked this actually.
Okay, great. And Marco, while you're there, let me ask you a follow-up question. A lot of people feel uncomfortable with the word advocacy when talking about the work of think tanks. How do you respond when people say, but surely think tanks are not supposed to be doing advocacy? What's your response to that?
Well, you know what? Since I'm beside my position in my organization, I am consultant on lobbying and advocacy. It's much easier for me to speak about advocacy than about lobbying. So I don't find that word, I don't some kind of taboo. So I don't know. In Serbia, we can freely speak about advocacy. And when we think about lobbying, it's not the case. So I don't know. It's some kind of public engagement, and I don't think so. I don't find any problem with this.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Marco. That's really helpful because I think what the point you're making there, firstly, it's very contextual, and also there are distinctions between certain kinds of activity. And certainly the institute where I am at IDS, we do advocate. For example, we advocate for the acceptance and use of social science within the broader sort of array of knowledge contributions, for example, to COVID-19. And that's not always taken very well, but we do see that that's something we have a justification as an independent institution to be able to bring that to bear. That we'd see that as being different, for example, to lobbying a particular political party, to taking a particular action, and that's something we tread carefully around. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Marco. Sophie, I can see your hand is up too. What's your view?
Yes, thank you. I'm Sophie from the European Policy Center in Brussels. And I just wanted to react to what Marco said, because I think it was really interesting also looking at the questionnaire. I work on trying to bring civil society voices to Brussels and giving them a visibility to decision makers. And it's interesting because I feel there's a big question of whether advocacy is in the private or in the public interest, and whether it's individual interests or whether it's for the general population. And I feel that might be a question of legitimacy as well for think tanks, whether they represent really the general population and the general public, or whether they do have some certain kind of private or public interests, or at least individual interests that are not representative of the entirety of the population. And I feel that's a difficult question that I also face, because, for instance, for CSOs, it's really important to make sure that they don't see themselves as being lobbying, but at the same time, we're trying to explain to them that advocacy is important, because the points they make, for instance, it's human rights organizations from Hungary and Poland, they really need that kind of representation in Brussels. So I feel that there's a bit of a tension there between those questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sophie. Very interesting. And I think what you're describing is the kind of situation that think tanks have to navigate all the time, and can also get into quite serious challenges if they don't reflect on how they're positioning themselves into these debates and these sets of relationships. So that's a question that I put out to all who are on this in this Think Tankers school, is to be reflecting on that question, because it's one of those things that is very important to have a position on, and then to behave in ways which are aligned with your position, which you've arrived at in a very intentional way. It's not something that you can just let happen. Oh, we'll just see what happens. It's a very delicate balance getting that right. Let me just ask who also put policymaker engagement. As we've just heard, this can be taken as very close to advocacy. Let's see who else. Maybe someone as well who hasn't spoken. Perhaps one of our participants from Myanmar. If you had put policymaker engagement, I'm not sure whether any of you did.
Actually, in Myanmar, I think we still need to understand what advocacy actually mean is. Actually, in our country, advocacy, I think, is happening in two different forms. One is a rather informal forms, engaging with policy decision makers in their affiliated, closed channels or things like that. And another forms is also kind of like demonstrations by activist organizations. So we sometimes also consider this type of demonstration also as advocacy on the streets, or activist advocacies, or things like that. So we are still at the stage of understanding how it is the advocacy actually is how it is the advocacy usually conducted by research organizations, or the organizations which consider themselves as think tanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. And again, it's very contextual, right? So navigating that way forward in the context of Myanmar may be quite different to a think tank that's based in Brussels or a think tank that's based in Brazil. Just understanding how to position yourselves. You have to work through the reality of how you engage with whom, bringing what evidence to bear, how you share that data, how you promote and convene conversations and discussions, which are not going to result in you losing the ability to engage in those processes. We all know of think tanks that I remember actually in the early days of the Think Tank Initiative, one of the members of the Think Tank Initiative institutions heard on the radio that the government had shut them down. And then they went back to the government and said, well, we've just heard you've said we're closed, and we're not. And then there was a bit of a discussion then about ways in which certain people within the government were perceiving that think tank to engage in public policy dialogue. Shortly afterwards, the government made another announcement and said, sorry, we were mistaken. In fact, the think tank is still open, which was good news for the think tank. But a little bit of discussion had to take place then about different roles and responsibilities. And it's about navigating that tension. There are some movements and there are some citizen-led movements which very much are promoted to, really pushing through a change agenda. And think tanks have to think, how do you align with those? What is our role? Are we part of that movement? If we are, what is our role? Is our role more about the contribution of evidence and data and analysis with other members, depending on what they need, as opposed perhaps to be at the forefront of the advocacy movement? So these are things which think tanks really have to grapple with and to think through. And I'd encourage everyone to be thinking about these questions. Could I just ask, who puts civil society and citizen engagement as one of their choices? That you did too, so did Sophie. Anyone like to put your hand up who we haven't heard from yet? Perhaps Donia. I think we haven't heard from you yet. I think you're on mute, Donia.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I actually put that as something really important because the area I want to engage in with a think tank is education. And because it's a huge issue in my country, which is Tunisia, we're literally at a sort of standstill right now between what civil society wants, what the, how do you call them, les syndicats, the unions are demanding, and what the government is potentially in the capacity of doing. And so for me, right now there's conversations between the unions and the government, say politics, but it's not going really anywhere. And if there's anything that is going to be changed, it's through civil society because parents count and children count. So this is the engagement that we need at that level. So that was my choice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Donia. And I'll just take a couple more quick views. I can see Nusha.
Hi, I'm Nisha. I'm based in Belgium and Antwerp, and I also selected civil society and citizens, as I think that right now citizens start to participate more and more in the decision making and in political processes. So communicating to them the research and the data to give them the knowledge for this kind of decision making can help both politicians and researchers as well to avoid a lot of mistakes that might have happened in future. And as we can see with a lot of political processes that happened in the past few years, educating citizens on their political role and giving them the information, the right information, or teaching them how to distinguish this kind of information is very important.
Great, thank you. That's excellent. Very, very relevant in these days of stories about fake news and doubts about the validity of data and evidence, to be able to have that educative role. I think you touch into the sort of this broad label around capacity development as well when you get into that. So thanks for that. I'll just take one more. I think it's Jen. If I might come to you.
Yeah, I'm Kai from Myanmar. Yes, in my personal opinion, the most important function is like community engagement, because if communities are aware of the changes and aware of the advantages and disadvantages of what we do and what we did at that time, although the policymaker didn't know about it or policymaker didn't listen us, but they can change. Like for example, in last November, we have election. So at that time, through from the Facebook and social media, many communities means different level of communities make like social election campaign, like red campaign, and like to recommend or to elect our current government, something like that. So at that time, without policymakers or without communications or other things, but the community engagement is very important, and then we make the changes and we make the reform, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just take one last very quick comment from Chamta, if I may.
Hello, Peter. I'm Chanda from Pandita in Myanmar. For my opinion, it's not only civil society and civic engagement is the function of think tank. Like for my opinion, is research and communication is the main function of think tank. But the communication is different kind of communication, like a policy maker engagement, or like in Myanmar is just a transitional democratic transitional country, like a the policymaker, they don't have a capacity or knowledge about something, so the international development organization come here to educate them or capacity building in them to change policy. This is one of the communication. Another this is capacity development communication. Another is like a civil society or civic engagement. This is more like a outsider approach, like a movement approach, like the pressure to the policymaker or the members of the parliament to move to organize the power of the people to advocate something. This is like the main thing is research and communication is made. The communication is different from like a policy making engagement, capacity development engagement, or civic engagement. This is my opinion for think tank. Yeah.
Thank you, Chanta. I can see others are keen to come in, which is great. And maybe just Rowan, I'll just very quickly come to you, not to leave you behind, that, but we did hear a view from you earlier on. So Rowan, maybe just very briefly, and then we'll just move on to the next session. I hope we can still have a minute at the end as well.
Hello, thank you for giving me the floor. I'll try to be really quick. But I wanted to comment here because actually at the think tank I work with, like Ashok, actually it's part of the design of the organization is to have this engagement with the civil society. So to put things in context, we work in the region of the Middle East, and 10 years ago, like the uprisings happened, and people have aspirations. People had aspirations for a better future, but they did not really know how to bring that. They just came out to the streets saying, we want freedom, we want dignity, but then we want good governance. But then 30 years or so of political authoritative regimes and has left people and policymakers as well kind of uninformed and living in kind of let's say some sort of ignorance, kind of ignorance imposed by this absence of politics engagement and so on. So people have come down the streets, but then they failed because they did not know the rules of change. They did not know how to bring whatever they want to bring of change into reality. So a sharp part of it, what it thinks of, is to help in this informing of the action of these civil society and active youth, as well as engaging in other forms as well. So to cut it short, like we have 3 pillars. One of them is the academia part, which tries to take the knowledge from social sciences directly to to the civil society, and then part of it is also the youth and the hubs that are spread all over in the region, also in that aim, not just capacity building, but also as well providing that kind of informed knowledge. So yeah, I'll just cut it here.
Great. Thank you, Rowan. And I think what, again, you've just demonstrated, and several of the others who spoke earlier have shown, is that, again, these are not functions disconnected from each other. They're all deeply connected. If you're engaging with civil society, there's often an educative role or capacity strengthening role. The research itself is a way in which you can engage with different actors by engaging in the research together, whether it's about awareness raising or identifying the questions or carrying out the research or sharing the outcomes and the results. So these are very intertwined. And again, for any think tank, the question is, where can we put our efforts and really ensure that we're doing each of those functions well, but joining them up and connecting up the efforts so that they're really working together in a holistic way. Not easy to do. And these are things for think tanks to be grappling with how, and I think in the rest of the course, you're going to be hearing and engaging with others who are going to speak about some of those dimensions, about how to do each of those different things well. But I would just keep stressing, how do you make them work together is really central to the task for think tanks. So I'll just say very quickly, I think this very much kind of connects then to what you've just been talking about, all of you who just contributed. What can think tanks do? Well, promoting and using open data, facilitating knowledge and evidence sharing, strong communication, education, very much what you've just been saying. Knowledge synthesis, another very important role for think tanks. Very often, there are bits of knowledge or data or analysis which are spread about all over the place. And sometimes a really crucial thing is being able to bring those together. Sometimes it's through particular methodologies like systematic reviews, but it can also just be doing like a meta-analysis where you look back and you bring together different areas of knowledge and make that available so that people can actually see, okay, what's happening? How do we understand how all these different things fit together? Doing foresight work, doing scenario work. It's often very challenging thinking, what will our country be like in 10 years from now? 15, 20, 50 years? Very difficult questions. Think tanks are well placed to convene conversations about that and also to help in actually doing the work, bringing the methods and helping to do the analysis and helping to support the sense-making process so that any national group, whether it's government or other civil society actors, have the sense of possibility for where any national context could go in the future. Using different disciplines, different approaches. Again, that goes back to the sort of areas of challenge that we work on. Think tanks are very important because they often bring together different ways of looking at problems. It's not necessarily purely a macroeconomic take. It may also bring a political dimension. It may bring an anthropological dimension. It could bring health, education, social science disciplines, which together help to shed light on complex issues. And then very importantly, again, I think what many of you just been stressing is the importance of doing research with society. So finding what are the opportunities where research can make a difference, engaging with different communities, using participatory and inclusive approaches, ownership of that evidence by the people themselves. Again, if a think tank sort of suggests that, okay, we've generated this knowledge and it's ours and we'll give it to you, that's quite different from communities, civil society organizations, citizens, policymakers being part of evidence generating processes so that they own it as much as the think tank brings. And then, of course, ensuring as far as possible that the research you do actually can lead to actions and solutions. So these are all things that think tanks can do. Now, we're heading towards the end, but I've got one more poll, and I'd just like to put this one up very quickly, because when I discussed with Andrea about the preparation for this, we thought it would be interesting also, just at least for a few minutes, to talk a little bit about the kind of power dynamics that think tanks themselves have to navigate on the global stage. So, Andrea, if we could put this one up, and Christina. All right. Here's a question for you. All think tanks have equal opportunities to make a difference to global challenges, regardless of where the context where you come from. Do you agree or disagree or not sure? So, Christina and Andrea, how are we getting on?
So I think one more person. Okay. One more and it's done. Okay, done.
Right, let's see. And the answer is, oh, my goodness. That's quite a radically strong result. Okay. All right, let me start with the easy one. And we because of limited time, I won't be able to take too many views, but let's hear from someone who's not yet spoken, who disagreed, who put disagree. Someone who's not yet spoken. This is your moment in the sun. Who disagreed? And it's not yet spoken.
Can I share, Peter? I'm Ramo.
Please, Ramo, please, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I think like one of the fundamental reasons why global think tanks arise is because of the inequality in opportunities, and people need to articulate. And I find like, if you take the global scale, and there is a kind of a divide, and then even in the national context, and the divide of based on inequalities and opportunities are not equally given to everyone. So then in case of the state versus non-state actors, and in the civil society, again, the elitism and the common people at the bottom up, the bottom situation. So there is a kind of a divide in the ability and the opportunities to articulate in the both at the state and the non-state level. So I completely disagree with this question, and not that question is wrong, but this throws up a very important and significant the state of inequality in our global society and the national societies, and also at the bottom of our social and cultural levels. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Ramo. Marcel, I can see you have your hand up as well. We haven't heard from you yet. Let's have a quick thought from you.
Yeah, thank you. And hello to everyone from Berlin. I also do disagree, and I think it has two dimensions, and Ramo has touched on that.
Oh, we seem to have just lost you, Marcel. Just at the crucial moment. Okay. Marcel, I hope you'll come back to us. Pamela, your hand is up. Let's hear from you. Maybe
what
Marcel.
Can you not talk about?
Oh, sorry, Marcel. You're back. We lost you there completely.
Oh, did you hear what I said?
No, we didn't, unfortunately. Can you just very quickly reprise?
Yes, sorry. I think it's one, a matter of resources, and two, a matter of societal context and the question of how free you are to do research and express opinions.
Okay, thank you. Again, very contextual. Pamela, let's hear quickly from you.
So thank you. Funding for me is one of the reasons why we cannot regard them as having equal opportunity. The other aspect would be the capacity. Some think tanks, the smaller ones in particular, just don't have the capacity to be heard. The bigger ones, closer to governmental think tanks, are the ones that are often heard the most. And of course, those that are supported or funded by international sponsors and donors for their own purposes, but they are also heard in terms of making a global difference. The others, and it's most unfortunate that the smaller ones specifically, are closer to the ground and able to give more value when it comes to the experience on the ground, but they're totally not heard often enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. Mohammed, I'll take this as the last one.
Yes, thank you. I think the question should be, all think tanks have opportunities to make a difference.
Good.
But I think the word equal is problematic here, because of course it depends on resources, on the context, on the nature of the regime or government. But I agree with have opportunities, sure, but have equal opportunities, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, essentially, not to spend a lot of time on this, but I think we're all conscious that even though we have global frameworks and we're increasingly talking about challenges as universal, and there's increasingly emphasis on collective effort, there's still very strongly a northern bias. There are still certain countries and certain institutions in those countries that tend still to secure funding and resources, which in the end is very, very important to enable them to do work, which perhaps others who can do work equally and on the ground may not be accessing those same kinds of resources. And also the ears of those who tend to listen to certain types of institution in certain locations. Other inequalities still persist, gender inequalities within many think tanks themselves or within many systems. We know that there are biases around whether women or men are able to develop their careers and their professional progress, which are constrained by inequalities within the system. We know that there are inequities both within and between nations about access and opportunities to do research, to access information, to engage with the use of evidence. We know as well that there is a sort of systemic bias in the broad research system where certain researchers from certain contexts find it much more difficult to get access to education, to be able to further their career, to opportunities to actually come up through the system where they're able to make that contribution in global dialogues. And mobility, I mean, right now it's an interesting time with the pandemic. We've actually been thrust into a situation where perhaps there are now more opportunities for inclusion, again, like this kind of webinar, where people are able to come together and engage virtually instead of having to rely on traveling around the world to get to certain locations where people tend to gravitate, often at great expense. So this is an interesting, perhaps, moment of opportunity for improving the possibility for participation and inclusion of researchers from different parts of the world, different contexts in these global processes. And maybe that's a hope for the better, that some of these changes will actually solidify and be maintained. So what can think tanks do to address some of these issues? Well, they're not easy, but if I take the example of IDS where I work, collaborating on what we call universal challenges, again, moving that away from just thinking about development, north and south, them and us. These are shared challenges, they're common issues. We all have something to bring to shed light on challenges which need to be looked at from many different sides, not only partial views being brought to bear. So framing these challenges as universal and collaborating. Relationships, which are very thoughtful and intentional. There's a very interesting work around sort of partnerships in development called Relationships Matter. And of course, that's something that's easy to say, but actually developing equitable, trustful, transparent partnerships and relationships is central to the ability to work on shared universal challenges. Going it alone in your own little corner is likely to lead to remaining isolation. So joining up effort, being more engaged, being more collective. Demonstrating, walking the talk around the actual issues that we're working on. So for example, IDS, again, where I work, we have a lot of programming and research on climate and environmental challenges. We need to look at our own carbon footprint. We need to look at our own environmental footprint. Are we traveling excessively? Are we part of the problem rather than being part of the solution? And being very conscious of that and talking about it and engaging others in conversations around that. Connecting the local and the global. Again, many think tanks in national contexts are very strong on working on issues perhaps with their own constituents, with policy actors in that country, although even then it may be challenging to actually get those connections. But finding ways to connect with global networks, with initiatives. One of the beauties of this Thinktankers school is that we have a group of people who are coming together from all over the world. You're forming, in a way, an instant alumni and a set of relations that I hope will continue long after this school and will be part of a much sort of broader collective of individuals within organizations who can continue to share, exchange experience and information, and to keep learning together. Because again, this is core, I would say, for mutual benefits to really come through and to ensure that there's a possibility for things to improve, for solutions to be found, is that learning needs to be at the center of everything. So I'll just come to a quick end. Well, just leave you really with some very, very brief reflections, as I know time is just about out. And I'll just, pose this question to you. Very often, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's inequalities, whether it's political challenges around accountability or governance, why don't we just find a simple solution to a problem? Well, the reality is that most problems are like the proverbial elephant. We all see a different piece of the elephant depending on where we come across it. This is the old story about a group of people who encountered an elephant, who couldn't see the elephant, but felt the part of it that they came into contact with. So you can see on the far right side, there's somebody who's got hold of the tail of the elephant who is convinced that what they have is a rope. They have somebody who's grabbed the ear of the elephant and they're convinced that they're dealing with a fan. Somebody else has got hold of the leg of the elephant and they're dealing with what they think is a tree. Somebody else has got the trunk and they think it's a snake. So depending on which part of the elephant you get hold of, you have a view that the answer lies there. If you think it's a rope, you'll deal with it like a rope. If you think it's a snake, you'll deal with it like a snake. None of those individuals have realized that they're dealing with a complex creature called an elephant. So one of the huge advantages that think tanks can do is to emphasize that even when things are complex, it's possible to approach complexity by bringing different views together in intentional and well-crafted ways to help develop an understanding of complex situations. And I'll just give you this little quote that I like very much, and it's a very good reminder, and it's one of these that I think many people often have on their desks. For every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. The challenges that we've started describing in this session are big, they're complex, they affect all of us, and they're related. So, we are making huge progress on many agendas. We're seeing improvements addressing inequalities, environmental sustainability, and inclusion, but there is still a huge way to go. There is still so much more to work on these, and this is a role for think tanks to contribute through data, through analysis, through bringing evidence to bear, looking at the connections and on the margins of the challenges, not necessarily just the leg, which is the trunk, or the tail, which is the rope, looking at that whole interrelated set of issues and thinking, where are the connections between all of these? What can we say about those to help people understand them more? Focusing on excellence, that's the currency of think tanks, and engagement with different actors, which generates change. Recognizing that politics and power is at the root of the most difficult challenges. Many challenges could be addressed, but we know the reason that they are not is because of issues of politics and power. And that's something that think tanks need to find ways of engaging with in ways which are political but not partisan. Constantly demonstrating why evidence and research is valuable. Don't take it for granted. We're seeing the value that the COVID-19 crisis has brought to demonstrating the purpose and the value of science and evidence and research to millions of people who perhaps haven't been so aware of it until now. Demonstrating that value of how it can make a difference is another role for think tanks. Co-creation of knowledge on those pathways of change, working with others, ensuring that the processes involve others, engage others, promote empowerment through engaging with knowledge and ownership of the knowledge and therefore with the solutions. And then lastly, being reflective. Reflecting on questions, acting on those reflections, testing things out, but most important, being continued learners. So I think I would end by saying that if think tanks can be leaders in learning, they have a very strong possibility of promoting positive change. But that takes effort, and it takes intent, and it takes commitment, and it involves working together. So I wish you all a lot of luck and enjoyment in the rest of this course as you continue to grapple with these reflections. And I'd be very happy to continue a conversation around all of this going forward as well. Andrea?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I really enjoyed the session today. It's been very, very interesting. I love the journey that we took from the global challenges to what the functions of think tanks can be in this messy world. I also really enjoyed all the participants, all of your interventions, and I think that the contextualization and seeing how these different issues play out in each of your contexts was really interesting as well. I also really like the final reflection. I'm going to use that as a quote for the session today on being leaders at learning to promote change. That really resonates with what you were discussing of we're rubbish at learning, and that as think tanks and the access to data that we have we can really play a role into that. And as always, time always runs short. And we can take this conversation onto Slack if you have any more questions for Peter. He's already there, and I think he's been somewhat active. So if you can, Peter, it would be great if we can continue this at Slack. So if you have any other questions, we'll just, if you want, we can create a channel for this, or we can do the general chat.